In this movie, I'd like to talk about formatting numbers in e-learning projects. Some of the projects I work on have large amounts of numbers, either lists or statistics, and I need to find ways to make them visually more interesting. Don't always have the option to do that with every client, but when I can, I certainly like to take advantage of it. So let me share some of that with you. The two main types of fonts when it comes to numbers are monospace and proportional. So let me give you some examples here. Monospace means that each character has the same amount of space allotted to it. So because of that, they line up beautifully when you're trying to line them up vertically. You can see that these numbers are lined up very well. The other type is proportional. Proportional is when it is based on the font and also based on the numeral itself. Not every numeral has the same width, so they would vary, and they would also vary depending on the font as well. So you can see that in the example I have here on the right, the numbers on the right don't line up very well at all because it's naturally kerning them based on that font and the fact that it is a proportional font. So here are some basic examples of monospace fonts that you might want to try, some for Windows and some for Mac, especially if you're going to be trying to line up lists of numbers. Next, let's talk about the two different types of numerical data that we deal with mainly. One of those is statistics, and the other one is actual sets of data for analytics or for measuring. Most people find it easier to remember approximations instead of exact figures. And the example I give here is it might be easier to remember which entree on the menu was the most expensive rather than trying to remember the exact price of every entree. So it's a good idea to keep that in mind when you're putting together your training. Here are some more tips for dealing with numerical data. I try to use familiar items whenever possible. Graphics really help achieve this. If there's a number in the story that's really key to the message, it's a really good idea to call attention to that, as I've done here. So I'm saying that 20% of the staff completed their training. Notice that I made one of the characters and the 20% the same color to drive home that point that only 20% have completed their compliance training. Much more effective than just simply typing the phrase 20% of our staff has completed their compliance training. Not as interesting as having it to look at visually. So here are some examples of, another example of maybe graphics. Like I said, using familiarity whenever possible. So the one on the left just says sales increased 50% in the first quarter. Not very exciting, but the one on the right kind of drives that point home a little bit. The arrow facing up because the sales increased, and by putting the little chart graphic underneath it, it just gives it a little bit more of a visual. Much more interesting to look at this than it is to just look at this one sentence over here. Here are some different examples of graphs that you can use. There are other types of graphs, but these are some of the main ones that I use. I use column graphs a lot. Easy to create them in Illustrator, and frankly, really easy to just create them on the fly. I do it in Storyline or Adobe Captivate all the time. So you just need to kind of plot it out maybe on paper visually first, but again, very super easy to create in Illustrator as well. Pie graphs are always very useful and they always look great on screen. This one just has a little bit more dimension to it, but again, very easy to create in Illustrator. And then the line graph, also very easy to create in Illustrator. I create mine a lot of times just from scratch right in Storyline. There is a drawing tool that allows me to do this. I would also add here that if you're having more than one line on your graph, it's a good idea to separate them by color, by thickness, maybe making one a dotted line and the other one a solid, something like that, so that you can tell them apart. And lastly, just to talk quickly about using pictographs. This is another great way to display data. So you can see on the one at the top, I'm showing the number of donuts sold at each one of this store's locations, but they're listed by dozen, and it's very easy to tell at a glance which one sold the most and which one sold the least amount, and very easy to figure out how many dozen each one sold. But it's visually very appealing to look at, much more interesting than just a list of numbers. And the same with down here, I just have a thin line separating them. You know, you want to give them a little bit of separation so that you can tell that they're separate thoughts as I've done here. But pictographs really do help people to make comparisons more easily and help them to really retain the content a lot better. These are just some of the ideas that I use when I'm formatting numbers in my e-learning projects.